So we're talking about decentralized identity. This has been worked on by a variety of different companies over the last, I'd say, maybe 5 to 10 years. We've seen efforts by Sam Altman from WorldCoin out there scanning people's irises and faces and giving them free coins and some kind of weird things that have been happening there. We've got verifiable credentials and digital identity that have been attempted by Circle. And today we want to talk about what's happening on the Cardano network. So we've got our friend Rob back again. Our first Cardano episode, we talked a bit about this, but we wanted to give it some more depth and take a bit more time to set up what exactly is decentralized identity, verifiable credentials, and then talk a bit more about how the Cardano network and developers on the Cardano network are doing some stuff with the Midnight network. So, Rob, welcome to the show. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back. I had a really great time the last time. It's been a long time since I've had that much opportunity to talk about a subject I love, for such a long time. I mean, primarily, you know, when I mention anything about blockchain, people just go, their eyes turn hazy and they go, "Oh, I don't want to hear about this," or they sort of make fun of it. And so it's really great to have a group of people and a community where people can actually discuss this in some intellectual way. In some cases very objectively, in some cases not so objectively. Stuff like that. Um, so this is awesome. So when I think about identity or self-sovereign identity or decentralized identity. So, I mean, probably by now we've heard of governments, and the United States government wants to do the same thing. We've heard about centralized DIDs or digital IDs, and there's going to be all kinds of attempts for government to issue, a centralized digital ID, and in some cases it'll be governments in India, and China has them already, because it really does make your life better in some ways when you interact with services because you have an ID. It's a digital sort of a think of it kind of like a digital token that you can use to interact with services. The problem with that is that these are programmable. So a digital ID is programmable, and it means that you can put anything in it or you can take anything out of it. So, or you can read the information that's in it. And so when a company or um, a government wants to issue you a digital ID, it means that they own the data that's in it and they can read anything that's out of it, or they can or they can subscribe to the information, and so the information can be used then to take actions on their part, whether against you or give you advantages. So the real, I think, example of what could be done with these things is in China. It's we have these things called the digital yuan. Basically, it's a programmable social engineering sort of technique,
Well,
where
wait, before we go
yeah,
to China, one second.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So there's one thing that I was recently apprised to, and that's that Estonia has actually been working on digital identities and what they call EID for
yeah,
quite some time.
yeah,
So these guys, if you haven't heard about what's been going on in Estonia. Apparently, the Russians were attacking the Estonian voting system, which was one of the things that prompted them to get really interested in this. So they have done the state issued digital identity already, and have been doing it for some time now. I don't know if this is quite the thing that we're going to talk about today, but as you're mentioning, just because you said
yep,
there are governments and centralized and what have you, I wanted to make sure that we at least pointed this one out because it was on my radar and it's happening. So I
yep.
think you're 100% correct that this digital identity stuff has been going on for some time. It's relatively new, but it is definitely a wave that's happening, and it will be more ubiquitous as we move forward here.
Well,
Right. Oh,
as you
go
guys,
ahead. I'm sorry.
as you guys are talking about identity too, I wanted to also maybe put a little background in, because really what we're talking about here is privacy. And we're talking about, instead of the government, or there being one sole issuer, or controller of privacy, of moving that into the hands of self-custodying your identity, is self-custodying your privacy, and choosing which aspects of your identity to reveal is kind of the eye on the future. And Grant, I'm really glad you brought up Estonia, because they were, uh, as far as I know, I believe they were the first to adopt electronic currency. So, um, uh, in the early days of Bitcoin, I kept wondering if they were going to move to the Bitcoin standard that we now see the likes of El Salvador moving to. But anyway, sorry to interrupt, Rob. Keep going.
No, that's perfectly great. So the primary reason I'm bringing up, well, I mean, you talked about Estonia. Now, Estonia created it to protect their populace, but theoretically, that that digital ID could be used for anything, from a government perspective. So it could be used to control your behavior in a lot of different ways, right? It could also be used to protect you and stuff like that. So what I really want to get to is definitions. So when we talk about creating digital IDs, we're really talking about really two big differences, and that is the primary thing I want to stress here, is that the difference between a digital ID, for example, the one that the digital yuan, or the Estonian one, the EID, in Estonia, um, those are not owned by you, right? So they're owned by the the government, or the country, or the company that sort of issues them, right? So um, it's the same sort of thing. Like, all the Web 2 standards are based on a digital ID. When you go and sign up for something, and you click sign in with Google, basically it creates a token. I mean, you could even think of it. I mean, in many ways, it's like an NFT, but it's a token that basically allows you to access these services, probably for a period of time. But you don't own that information. I mean, you can't um, you can't even go and uh, you know keep the you can't keep the data that that utilizing your did actually produces, right? So this is the difference. So a decentralized, we're talking about a centralized ID. So in general, you're going to say centralized ID. And then the other thing is and you almost have to specify it, a decentralized self-sovereign digital ID.
Yeah, the
And
decentralized self-sovereign is like the key differentiator of what we're talking about here. Because everything that you've got, whether it be a Google identity, your government issued identity, or your Facebook identity, those have a centralized component to it. You're not actually in control of your data, and you're not in control of the amount of data that gets revealed about you. And because those centralized identity systems exist, they have control over your data, and they can monetize it, they can give it away to advertisers, they can do whatever they want with it. So you can't say, well, I only want to tell people that I'm over 18 or I'm over 21. They know what your birthday is because you had to give it to them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have let you have an identity that said that you're over 21, because they need you to give proof. And that's what all that KYC and all that kind of stuff is. So I think this is where, and when we look at this triangle, we've got this difference between the person who holds it, the person who can verify it, and the person who issues it, right?
yep. Yeah, and so this is an example, and it's a pretty typical example. It follows. So there's a standards organization. I think it's called the W3C Standards Organization, and so they sort of define. I guess you can say it's the architecture. So this is kind of the architecture of the system, right? So you have um, in this particular case, you, the person who wants to have the identity, you are the holder, you are the owner of it, right? And so then what you have, and this is the important, and this is the hard part. So maybe I mentioned this before, but this verifier part. So this verifier is going to be, it's going to be a government, for example. It's going to be the DMV that issues you a driver's license. It's going to be, it could be credentials for a college degree at school. Like I had quite a lot of conversations with people from St. Thomas um, about putting their credentials online, and for various reasons, they it just wasn't a possibility then. Um, and but however, there are schools and organizations, for example, like there are some schools in Africa that issue verifiable credentials. So in other words, they are the verifier, and those credentials are, graduating from school, graduating from college, and then what you can do is you can take those credentials with you. You own them; they're yours. Um, they're simply verified by the school, and then there's a few schools and a few colleges in California that accept those credentials, so you can use them instead of calling up the school. And like I said before, I was on like the 15-year plan for school, and sometimes when I would go for like a couple years without taking any classes, and I'd have to get my transcripts from this school or that school or whatever it is, and it was always difficult, right? Because I didn't own them. I had to go to the schools and I had to ask them, and they had to send them to me, whatever it was, right? So this sort of changes the model. So it's sort of like a push model versus a pull model. So in other words, you are pushing, you own the credentials, so you push them to whoever asks them from you, and then the issuer in this particular thing from the trust triangle part is um, whoever uses this Hyperledger Identis. And so maybe I'll just spend a moment talking about this. Hyperledger Identis was created and by Charles's company IOHK. IO Global, I think, is what it technically what it was. And so and it is a verifiable credential, decentralized self-sovereign identity thing that used to be called the Tala Prism. And it does, it issues credentials, it issues um, educational credentials was again the biggest one because they had already developed some relationships. So um, I'll go back to this verifier part. The verifier part is the hardest thing because let's say somebody just puts a credential on their phone, even with all of this stuff, right? So it doesn't mean that you can use that credential to derive any advantages, to use the benefits of having that credential. In other words, the people that are responsible for providing the credential have to agree and have to support using this sort of uh, methodology, this Hyperledger Identis stuff, using it to provide a credential that is actually valid, right? Um, and so, it comes down to, people have been saying, for example, that we can get,
Is
voting.
that because it's the mechanism under which you would check the ID? Because I
Yeah,
think about this as like you go to the club, right? And the bouncer's at the door and he looks at the ID, and that's really the point at which, the bouncer is saying, well, I think that, this girl is trying to present a fake ID so she can get into the club and dance and party and do whatever. But like he's the one that's responsible. So in this sense, the verifier is the bouncer who's sitting at the door checking IDs, and like you actually have it, but you still have to be able to have some mechanism whereby you can say this thing's valid or it's not, or there's some reason why you might not want to trust it, or but that this might have been something that wasn't created correctly, or that it's been forged, or that the person who was issuing it, maybe this issuer got compromised and they started issuing a bunch of bogus ones. So anything after XYZ date should be untrusted. Is that kind of the gist
Yeah,
of it?
yeah, I think that's exactly right. And if you think about all of the stuff we do online, all of the so we talked a little bit about this idea of um, so security is one thing, right? So the other really good part of this is agency, right? So these are in my opinion, these are sort of the two big things, security and agency. If you can think about what a digital ID, an appropriate digital ID allows you to do, right? It allows you to do, everything online. It allows you to log into services. It allows you to use services. It allows you to, spend money. It allows you to earn money. It allows you to have access to data, private data. It allows you to, uh, uh, do whatever it is you do on the internet or online or whatever it is, right? So this identity, if it's done right, it gives you agency over your stuff, over your stuff. And so, yeah, security and agency, right? So I'll just mention this one thing that Charles did. So I went to this conference, Rare EVO 2024, just a little while ago. It was in Las Vegas, and he set up this. Um, so there is a wallet. It's called Lace Wallet, and basically, it's become that's essentially another product that IOHK has created. And what it can do is it can make um, these paper wallets where it has a kind of a code on it, and people can scan the code, and it actually
What
does
was
the
that?
same
What was the
thing.
name of the conference? So I'll
uh,
throw it on the screen.
Rare Evo.
Rare Evo.
Yeah. And so this Lace wallet, you can print out a wallet. So instead of having a recovery phrase, right, you can print out a wallet and put it on paper, and put it in your safe or whatever it is, and you can use that wallet or that paper wallet to recover your crypto or whatever it might be, right? So it's kind of replacing the recovery phrase that we're all familiar with. We put in those 24 words or whatever it is. I know some of them are different than others, but so what Charles did was he said, okay, I am going to put one of these paper wallets in public space so that everybody could see it, and we're going to give you an opportunity to break into it. If you can break into it, there's $1 million in this thing, and you can have it. It's yours. So that is one of the things that this whole cryptography and that's one of the things that
Did
is
anybody
so
claim the
important.
prize? You can't leave us hanging.
No,
Like what
no,
happened?
no, no one's claimed the prize.
Oh,
There's $1 million sitting in there, and no one could break into it. People have been trying now for a bit now, but you just can't do it. And so, you know, it's it's really, I think we've kind of, it's certainly not a perfect system. So people are going to maintain the security, um, and primarily when we make a mistake, it's because someone else is able to get things like our recovery phrase or something like that, because we didn't treat it appropriately or something like that. Or it's probably going to be someone who knows someone, and so it's going to be kind of social engineering that's going to do it. um, but I don't think just being able to, I mean, even with quantum computers, but I could be totally wrong about that. I think the security thing is like a million times better than what we have now. Um, and so again, the object isn't to be 100% perfect. The object is to make it so that it's a million times better, and that the cost of breaking into something, or considering the compute resources you might need, are going to be a lot more than what you would obtain by getting into the wallet.
Well, this is the thesis of software. So what you're talking about right now resonates a lot with us, because this idea that blockchains can provide this cyber dome of security, especially given the fact that the U.S. Social Security number index just got hacked through whatever, this really is the kind of stuff that needs to be brought into the world to upgrade the security of how we're doing all of this stuff. Like, it's just not appropriate to have, some 8-digit number that everybody's using, and it's just in plain text, and that's the basis of all identity, credit, and everything that exists here. Like, we need to do something slightly better, and we definitely have the tools and the technology to do it. The thing that's important, and I think that you're espousing, is that it be self-sovereign and that it be privacy protecting. Like, if it doesn't have those aspects, then we should probably say, well, we can do better than that. Let's move on and do it better. So is that what Midnight Network brings to the table? Like, I know that you mentioned it last time and we put it in our title, and there's some idea that zero knowledge proofs comes into play here. Is zero knowledge proofs the way that you actually protect the data that would be associated with the identity? And that's how we hide the information away?
Yeah. So if you think about, I mean, a lot of people don't understand what a zero knowledge proof is, and obviously the people we have here are really educated about it. But if you think about what a zero knowledge proof is, so I think that the most obvious real example is, let's say you go into a bar, and typically the way you show you way you the way you show that you're legally able to drink is to take out your driver's license and show them, right? So, oh, okay, you're 21. But the thing is, there's all kinds of other information on that thing. There's your address. There's even, if you can scan all the information that's on there. These are real IDs too. So they have all kinds of different information that somebody could be used. But the idea is that when you go into a bar, for example, you can prove that you're 21 without actually showing them the 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 data, without actually showing them. So
Yeah, and
um,
the trick is that the bouncer, the person who's asking for the information, can trust the fact that you're telling the truth, and they can verify that you're telling the truth.
right, that's the big one. So I also think about this. So let's just imagine that you have a cave, right? And you hid uh, behind a locked door. You hid a message, and the message just said, "Hey, I've solved this problem. I know what it is." Right. So somebody comes up and says, "Hey, I can prove that I know what's on that message, or I can prove that the message is there without actually showing you that I can break in." So what it means ultimately is that you have to have a key to open the door, and then you have to get in and read the message. So, with the zero knowledge proof, you can just somebody can come up and say, "Hey, I can prove that I can read it." So they'll go into the cave and they'll come back out, and you know they'll say, "Okay, this is what the message showed," or something like that. It's a great way to basically hide information, and present only what's necessary to do the job that, for example, was required. So I'll mention this too. So I wish I was looking for the study, the document. So just recently, there was a study, and it was done by a bunch of big, uh, like MIT and Microsoft and stuff like that. And it was about personhood. So there's this personhood credential, basically. So it is designed um, in such a way, it's very Web 2. And so we should probably talk about a little bit about what we might think the definition of that is too. But the idea is, in a Web 2 environment, right? So typically you go through the process of, I mean, what happens when you sign on to a Web 2 service or whatever it is? You have to put all your KYC information in there. You have to put everything in there. And then the company has it and owns it. But you know, uh, the idea with the personhood thing is to use things like a zero knowledge proof in a Web 2 world, right? And to prove personhood, to prove that you have the rights to do something without actually, showing. But again, that goes back to the definition of what a centralized DID is and a decentralized self-sovereign ID. So what's happening is that a lot of companies are sort of, a lot of governments, a lot of companies are sort of mucking up the distinction between what these things mean, right? Oh, you can do zero knowledge proofs on in Web 2, but it's still a centralized ID. But most people are not going to know the difference. Most people don't really care. In fact, that's kind of the point here, is that when we build these systems, we build them in such a way so that people don't really care. They just, their things just work. They can live their lives. They can go to work. They can buy food for their family and stuff. They don't care about blockchain. They don't really care about this or that. What they care about is, supporting their families and stuff like that. And so that's why these things like centralized IDs are kind of insidious, because again, we don't own that ID, and they can use it in however they want to. They're going to be able to sell the data, or
Well,
all
and
kinds of
and
things.
and I think we've discussed this on a previous show, but like I'll just reference it. Kennedy was talking about this, and one of the times when he really came around to why does decentralization matter, and he even went further from not talking about custodial risk, but just when you have a centralized entity that is able to control whether your thing is valid or whether you can transact, it means that you can be locked out from the system. You can be deplatformed. You can be removed from the system if you do something that's distasteful to the people who are in control of that centralized platform or that centralized identity system. And so decentralization doesn't matter until you get rugged or until you encounter this sort of custodial or deplatforming risk, and then suddenly you realize how important it is that not any one entity be in control of that kind of stuff. Because if there is an entity that's in control of that stuff, if you find yourself on the wrong side of it, then suddenly, you no longer have access to society. So the decentralization thing, I think people wake up to it more and more. The When they start to encounter the problems that centralized systems have. And the thing is, we just really haven't had these massive centralized systems for that long. I mean, the internet really isn't that old. And even when it started, it looked way different than this centralized way that it exists now. So we've really only entered into the world of hyper centralization and big players being in control of this stuff within the last few years. So now that we're seeing sort of the dangers of what that might mean to society, I think people are going to be much more keyed into this. And it's not necessarily that the average day person is going to, know exactly what this means, but the people that are creating systems and have encountered this, they're going to prefer this type of thing. And I think that it's going to be more likely that this style of an identity system will catch on versus saying, let's just repeat the mistakes of the past that we've done when we've created these identities within Microsoft and Google and Facebook and whatever else.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's becoming more and more centralized. It's becoming more and more. I mean, in my opinion, that's sort of the definition of Web 2, as it exists now. So Web 2 is this idea that, and identity is at the core of it. Um, and people have, okay, this is Web 2, this is Web 3, this is Web 3. But I still think it comes down to, I mean, to me, the original concept was let's say in gaming, for example, you create a user. That user is an identity, um, and it sort of, you should be able to take that identity and sort of uh, un un you know undock it from the application, the game, and then move it to another application or game or whatever it is. And I think in a lot of ways, Google has kind of done this. Um, and I would not say I use Google. I mean, I'll admit, I've been developing stuff on Google Cloud for a while now, and that's kind of in my opinion, that's sort of the core of what Web 2 versus Web 3 is. Is owning your identity from Web 3's perspective, and not owning it from Web 2's perspective, right? There's all kinds of things that can happen if you own your data. You can profit from it.
Yeah,
That
yeah, I'd say kind of the couple of the dividing lines, in my opinion, that separates the ways that we think about Web 2 and Web 3 is Web 3 incorporates the idea of real ownership, decentralization. Those two things are kind of the key differentiators, is that you have the ability to really own something, and you have that ability because that underlying infrastructure is decentralized. So you're participating in the consensus, you're participating in the network itself, and you have the ability to own things through some control of private keys and that cryptography interaction that exists. I think those are, in my opinion, the main things that Web3 has brought to the fore, is this idea of true ownership.
I agree. I mean, if you go back to now Klaus and the wonderful, WEF, you come to this situation where they actually, and it was actually written in a paper. I thought at first that it was kind of FUD or not true or whatever it is, but so one of the large members of the WEF wrote a paper, basically, the adage of you will own nothing and be happy. We're all going, well, that's about the most dangerous damn thing I've ever heard in my life, right? And so that to me is kind of the core of this all. So agency and security. And so since we have Midnight up here, so we have some idea of what zero knowledge proofs are. We have some idea of, I'm sure we pretty much all have an idea of what smart contracts are and stuff like this. So the core part of Midnight is this ability to take stuff that is existing in private space. So existing on your phone or in your computer, and that private space could be anything. It could be documents. It could be coins in a wallet. It could be, a session token. Um, you know, it could be something that it could be your medical information. It could be your bills. It could be anything, right? So the idea is to be able to take that information and keeping it secure and on your system so that you have control over it, and then to write these things um, called circuits. So basically, it can act so that there's this thing called the witness function, and the witness function is responsible for determining, okay, you've got this and this and this on your, um, yeah, that's it. And what it does is it takes that information, runs through this thing called a circuit, and then what it can do is it can assert on the blockchain only the information. So this is zero knowledge proof thing is sort of reactive to this circuit. And I know that sounds, it's a pretty simple concept to take private information and be able to act on it in a public space with only the information that's necessary, right? So you can have all kinds of things. So I mean, to me, I get goosebumps thinking about this because it means we can do things like have generalized voting systems. Um, Imagine being able uh, to have your identity and to have your, things like your your address and to know information about, what voting district you're in or something like this, and all that stuff is stored in your private space. And then when an election comes up, all you have to prove ultimately is that you have the rights to vote in this election. And then, you can vote all electronically, all very secure, like a million times more secure than what our election system is now. And I know people are going to take a long time to believe that to be true, but it technically and practically and with all sincerity, this thing allows you to do this. That's just one of the uh, one of the use cases. Some of the other use cases. So I think of like so you had
Well,
there.
let's
Yeah,
break
yeah.
this down for a second. So, we've got this idea on Midnight that we can put a circuit or that we can have some
Mhm.
zero knowledge proof, and the utility for doing this on decentralized identity. uh, The thing that first comes to my mind, and I'm hoping that you can help me understand this a bit better, is somewhere that the actual data has to exist, right? Like, there's
Yep.
got to be a place where your birth date is actually stored, your real name is actually stored, your birthplace is stored. So is that what Cardano is doing here? Is using the Midnight network and zero knowledge proofs to be able to actually store that data, and then you build a decentralized identity that's privacy protecting on top of that?
Yeah, the data could be stored anywhere, right? It could be accessed. So this is the distinction. So I also think about this identity stuff in terms of, and this is the way it's always been thought of too, in a company and in a network or whatever it is. There's this distinction between authentication and authorization. So the authorization part. So this is where the decentralized self-sovereign digital ID and the verifiers would come through. So ideally, what you'd have is a whole bunch of verifiers. Your driver's license, your credentials, and there are things you can do with just that information. So that could be used as a methodology to give you the permissions to vote, but it doesn't tell you anything about, for example, where your voting district is and stuff like that. So this is kind of what I'm trying to create on my side, is this idea that um, while you have permissions, or while you have authentication to do something, it doesn't really give you permissions to do it, because there's still lots of stuff that needs to be proven. But primarily, for example, let's say your medical records. If you were to put those um, in on a blockchain, and how people are going crazy with this particular concept, but put them on a blockchain, and then use these things called zero knowledge proofs and smart contracts um, to give AI access to it, right? So um, where you would give it permission to utilize the data that's in there without actually, you know, uh, giving it everything, okay. It seems to me like a wonderful solution to let to force AI to log into everything, right? So I don't know if I answered your question appropriately, but that is exactly how we sort of have to think about it. So um, one of the biggest places where most of this data is actually kept now is this thing called IPFS, or interplanetary file system, where there's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of documents and stuff like this. And so and the idea is to force processes to log into it, um, to give you you know to allow it to be used in certain ways, and AI is a big one. But for my case, I use a big document database called MongoDB. And MongoDB you just store documents on it. And so the idea for me is to take all those documents and assign ownership to them. You can assign ownership to them in however many ways you want, right? And then eventually get to the point where I use that circuit to write those documents to the public space, you know, um, which is the blockchain. And so most of those documents will be held on the blockchain, and then, or I should say, in MongoDB, and then there'll be references to them. So you'll have a bunch of references to those documents in your smart contracts, in the zero knowledge proofs. And then what would happen is the process would just, use it to give you authentication and authorization on those documents, or something. It's a way to prove, for example, intellectual property.
Well, but go back for just a
Yeah,
second, because I'm curious about this MongoDB part,
yeah,
because
yeah,
that's like has to be stored someplace, right?
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. So the MongoDB part is actually in it's on Google, right? But it's encrypted, just like pretty much anything else. But the idea is to not leave them on in MongoDB. The idea is to put them on the blockchain.
that's why you were talking about IPFS or something like
Right,
that, because you
right.
got to have some decentralized storage mechanism.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, if you don't do that, it's just Web 2 stuff, right? So in other words, nothing's really changed, and we get to this point of
It's like a pinch point where we go back to having things be centralized, because it's one of the things that I like is this idea that it's 10,000 turtles all the way down, right? Until you get to the very bottom, and then you're like, oh yeah, we're just back to Web 2 again, because there's a problem that we haven't quite solved. But you really do, when you build a decentralized system, you have to be decentralized 100%. Otherwise, there's some point where it just falls back to something that isn't, or doesn't have some aspects that we need. And it just means that, the technology isn't quite there to do the thing that we really want to do. And we have to keep working on it. But it doesn't mean that it fundamentally can't work. It's just that we're saying, there's a problem right here, and we're going to have to solve that. But, it isn't solved at this current minute. And I think that this idea that you have decentralized storage and a mechanism for providing for decentralized storage and a way to monetize that is just a problem that yet needs to be solved, and we just need to work towards it. And IPFS was one of the first ways that people thought about doing decentralized storage.
Yeah, absolutely, that's true. Because and there's by now there's a whole bunch of other different ways, like NFTs. So typically, on even in Cardano or any other sort of uh, blockchain, NFTs are stored on the blockchain. So in other words, the actual data, most of the data of an NFT, for example, is not stored on the blockchain, but it's the metadata is, however, stored on the blockchain, and then mechanisms um, to retrieve the actual sort of data. And so most of the data is stored on you know uh, uh, decentralized storage services like IPFS or BlockFrost.io, I think, is another one. And there's a bunch of them. I'm not even familiar with all of them, but yeah. So that's right. So the actual data is stored, um, and when we talk about, well, when I think about Midnight, it's one of the things where I'm so I read this book a long time ago, and maybe I mentioned this the last time. I don't know. It's called Data and Goliath, and basically, it's about the dangers of the Web 2 services owning your data like crazy. Them utilizing it, them weaponizing it against you, or try to sell you stuff, show you only information, that they think you want to know. Um, and it comes down to this idea of understanding the dangers of that versus the the security and safety and um, the of a decentralized sort of thing. And I'll mention this, the Hyperledger Identitas. It is actually given. So what happened with the Hyperledger Identitas? It started as a project and a tool on um, with IOHK. So in other words, the product that they produced, just like they produced Cardano, they produced a wallet called Daedalus, and it's a full node wallet and stuff like that. And what ultimately they did was they gave it away. So now it is uh, sort of like the Linux Foundation. So Hyperledger Foundation, what it does is it takes a lot of these sort of projects and turns them into open source public things that people can use, but all of these, the data, the you know, the issuer, the holder, the verifier sort of stuff is all stored on the Cardano blockchain. And you know, uh, there's a lot of stuff on there. And if you were to try and start a node, and I'm sure it's probably the same with all kinds of other things, but if you were going to run a full node on Cardano, it takes up like 400 gigs of space. So it's getting expensive to run even to run Cardano because you need a lot of RAM, but primarily I mean, in my opinion, it's this huge amount of space that that everything needs because it's storing all this information. And then I'll say this: so Plutus had this sort of the original Plutus had this sense that it needed to have all of the scripts on chain. Everything needed to be stored on chain, and so it was slow. And then along came Plutus V2, which allows us to have references to scripts. So in other words, you can keep all your scripts in one place and it can reference them. So, which removes a lot of the necessity of storage for a lot of these things, and so it makes it faster. And then Plutus V3 is taking that concept to, and that's one of the things that was enabled, or to be honest, I think it's totally enabled. Plutus V3 is enabled in the latest Cardano hard fork, so which provides all kinds of advantages from that perspective. So I don't know.
That just went live a couple days ago. So as far as the digital identity stuff that's currently in development or available on Cardano, is this something that you could go get today if you were so inclined? Is that the current state of things? What is it called? And like, is there a main place that you could point us at that we could take a look at?
Yeah, so you can go to the Cardano Foundation. Cardano Foundation website. I think I just want to point you to the exact spot here. Cardano Foundation Web3 and Blockchain Solutions. So this is the so I don't know if it was a year ago or a year and a half ago. Cardano went full open source. So all of the ultimately the way they kind of had to do that is they had to give, so in other words, all the code is on GitHub, and it was given to this Cardano Foundation to manage it, and stuff like that. And so Cardano Foundation is responsible for for managing it, for being like the Linux Foundation. And so there's, yeah, I mean, you can just go and start researching and look at it from that perspective. But the Cardano Foundation is typically the place to start. There's going to be things like
But the digital identity product itself, like, is there some issuers and some verifiers? Like, can you go get one today, or is this still in development and we should be looking forward to it at a later point?
Nope. So there are some verifiers today. And let's see. So if you go to the hyperledger.github.io identis.doc. So here I'm just going to put, you probably have that there. I'm going to put that in the chat. So if you want to take a look at that. To be honest, I don't know how many. Well, you were actually showing this before, so I don't know how many verifiers they have. I'm not entirely sure. That's a good question. So
yeah, it's kind of my understanding that this is all still a bit developing, that there isn't really a chain yet that's got this cracked and that is still being worked on. So, as we're talking about timelines, or that people are excited about this kind of stuff, I feel like it's within the next 2 years or something like that we're really going to see the rise of decentralized self-sovereign identities. That's the timeline that comes to my mind.
yeah, I mean, it's not the technology nowadays. The technology's there, so that's what these, the things like the W3C standards and stuff like that. It goes back to the verifier. Like it becomes almost a political in nature to actually convince, for example, the DMV to say we're going to be a verifier, because they all have their systems, they all have their way of doing things. They all have their they all have their sort of philosophies about how it should be done, right? So the biggest work is about convincing all of those things that would be verifiers that you should be. And like I say, the technology is there. I don't think that's the problem anymore. I don't think it's the problem of you know and then you get to the political nature of you know the idea of what governments want to accomplish. They want to make they in many cases they want to control everything. They want to control information, and Brazil's proving this, obviously. um, Stuff like that. So, but having said that, I think we're finally at the point where we have all the tools to do it. So the technology's there, everything is in place, and now we just have to, and we have to convince verifiers. And a verifier doesn't have to be anything big. It could be so I don't know. There was one guy in the uh, and I'm sure you know him, Grant. So one guy from the Minnesota Blockchain Institute, who we talked about using a verifier and using a decentralized digital ID sort of thing, to enable voting in his HOA, because it was so um, it was so contentious as to be non-tenable, right? And so you can start small with these things and start building verifiers. To be honest, um, I I don't know how many verifiers, for example, that Hyperledger Identis has. I don't know, but um, I am implementing Hyperledger Identis into my app so that we can have credentials, verified credentials, and we can have non-verifiable but related credentials, like uh, address, for example. That would be verified in you know from the verifier, from the DMV or whoever it is, the driver's license issuance, the ID issuance sort of organization. But then you'd have this situation where you have all kinds of information, like what does your address allow you to do? What it allows you to do things like vote in certain locations. It allows you to if you combine the verified and non-verifiable but related credentials, and you produce some sort of a permission set for that, um, and then use that permission set in Midnight, for example, to execute on things, right? um, and so yeah, there's just a whole bunch of things that it enables you to do. And I'm sort of going beyond this idea of needing verifiable credentials. In fact, I kind of don't even think, for a lot of what I do, it's not going to be verifiable credentials that are necessary. It's simply going to be permissions. It's going to be permissions like your Google ID. Your Google ID is not a verifiable credential. It's not a verified credential. It's simply a methodology to say, you have a DID that was confirmed by Google or whatever it is. So it issues you a session token for when you want to use it. So there's all kinds of things that can be done without um, a verified credential. But I prefer a world where we have governments, where we have schools, where we have uh, you know organizations being the verifiers, and then us utilizing those verified sort of credentials.
So, Rob, if people want to keep track of this stuff and they want to watch for developments in the Cardano space,
Mhm.
what would be your recommendation? Like, who who should they follow, what should they be looking at, or are there places that you say this is really the right place to keep abreast of how this is developing and when they might be able to obtain one of these digital IDs and something that allows them to have permissions or some ability
Yeah.
to interact with things.
So, oops, there's this guy on Twitter and X, basically. It's called Army of Spies, or AOS. And to me, so if you look up, if you look him up and watch some of his past videos, watch him. So he's a really smart sort of guy who knows everything about Cardano, and so I've sort of utilized this guy over a period of time to really learn a lot about Cardano. And he's just a great guy. He never shows his face. He at first when he was doing this, so occasionally he has these these sort of uh, uh, streams where he covers his face over and something. I get it. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to show himself to the world. But Army of Spies, great guy. Look him up. But there's also, I mean, if you want to learn how to, for example, if you want to learn how to be a Cardano developer or something like that, so there's a, let's see, Cardano developer portal. It's pretty cool, and I'll post that in the link too. It's really a great place to get started, and it really shows you all kinds of different things. Plus, there's Discord. I will say that if you're really interested in Midnight, there is a Midnight Discord, and that the community is basically sort of getting involved in, or I've been involved in it from the beginning. So it's a Midnight DevNet Discord, and there's all kinds of information in there. And those guys are great, and they have a good community. It's not real big right now, but let's see if I could figure out. Well, yeah, I can't. I don't know what the Midnight Discord is, to allow them to give you an opportunity to log in and to utilize it. So that's probably going to have to come from them. So they'll send you an invitation or something like that. But if you go to Midnight Network, and there's going to be probably a link there to allow you to join the Midnight Discord.
Probably a good place to jump off is from
Yeah,
the X account and from the main links there.
yeah,
Well, yeah, this has been super fascinating, Rob. Really appreciate you coming back on to talk with us a bit more about Cardano and what's happening there. We'll be keeping abreast of the developments that are happening in the
cool.
world of decentralized identity, and hopefully, as more things happen, you'll give us a quick shout, and we can get you back on and talk about anything else that's happened. But we're definitely keeping our eyes on this stuff. Lucas, did you have any last minute thoughts before we close it out?
I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed getting into the discussion over Web 1, Web 2, Web 3 also. And I think that was crucial in understanding why zero knowledge proofs. And Rob, I think I, I share your anticipation for a world that's no longer managed, chaperoned in this. I want the internet that is fun and unbound in the way the anonymous Web 1 world was. And I think that this is the step that we have to take to get back to that.
Right.
So,
And
go ahead.
and just this idea that a founder, for example, of a company can be held responsible for all of the stuff that is put on their network, right? So there's going to be a whole bunch of different uh, things coming out, like Brazil coming after Twitter, and now, if you recall, there's this one back page where they were actually starting to prosecute the people who had Backpage, and Backpage was was working with them to try and uncover these things. And so, if you're a founder of a company and you could be held responsible for what gets put on there. And so my idea is ultimately to distribute ownership of things using DAOs and stuff like that. And then, have a group of people vote on whether they should use, say, okay, we've got a warrant for something from from some government or something like that, and should we enable that warrant? Should we satisfy it? Well, Elon Musk says no, um, but he's being personally held responsible for it. So I think this is a huge sort of uh, philosophy that is enabled with things like Midnight. So, I mean, I'll end on that. Um, and it's a new world, man, and we're right in the middle of it. And I wish I was like 20 years younger, because I'm not going to see probably a lot of the fruition of it. But this is something that I'm going to be working on for the rest of my thoughtful life, right? So at some point in time, I'd like to come back and just give you I mean, and certainly not next week, or maybe, I don't care, next month or something like that would be fine, or something like that. But I'd like to give us just an example, like a physical example, like show you what I mean with some of this stuff. So I can give you a demonstration of the app, or I can give you a demonstration the of the Midnight demo apps that they have, right? So we can do that any point in time, but I think once you see a demonstration of it, you'll go, So, but anyway,
Rob, it
yeah,
kind of reminds me of this Greek proverb. So we'll leave it with that. You're planting trees that you're never going to sit in the shade of, but society
exactly.
ultimately will thank you for what you're doing, and we're all looking forward to the new future that is less controlled by entities that are censoring and gatekeeping ideas. But we'll call it at that. And thanks so much for coming on. And we'll see
All right.
everybody tomorrow on FOMO.
Okay. Adios.